We're here today in the special exhibit exposing photography, anything but a small business. This runs through January 13 of 2024 here at the Marquette Regional History Center. I'm the curator, Jo Wittler, and this is Jack Deo, photographer and photo historian here in Marquette. And we've, along with some other people, put this exhibit together and wanted to talk a little about that process.
Yeah, we discovered a lot of amazing things in putting the show together, and Jo did most of the work on it, and I think she'll explain how she came up with the name here and what we've discovered.
Yeah, well, these people, men and women, from the earliest time, really, when photography got started with the daguerreotype process, the 1840s and 50s, they were coming here taking portraits, they were taking professional, documenting the businesses and what the towns looked like. So we have all this documentation, and then they were selling these stereographs and these beautiful prints. And then those started going out all across the country pretty quickly. So it was quite a business to produce these and print these images, and it's really left us this great legacy to study and learn from.
And we learned a lot about local photographers that we didn't know about, so we're going to share that with you now.
So we have these wonderful stereo views, and several of the photographers were marketing these scenic pictures, which also included Native Americans. So just great pictures of the harbor.
A lot of these were taken to show people who were investors in the mines and out east what was going on here. Right. So these were shipped all over the country. It was a big business doing stereo cards, but we discovered some of the earliest works here in putting this show together.
And then one of the things that amazed me, which I didn't understand at first, is that a lot of these stereographs, the early ones, were wet plate technology. And so, that involved the large box camera like we see here, which this was a dry plate.
Right.
But you had to develop them in the field. I mean, it was quite a process. And they were going, to pictured rocks. They were going down in the mine.
They had to haul all the glass plates, all the chemistry. In fact, the one card that we're looking at of the fire of Marquette, you actually see the dark tint that was used to sensitize right on the spot. He could go into that little tent and load up his plates. So that's an emery shot we're looking at there.
Yeah. Yeah, so Emery was one of those really early photographers who, of course, captured the burning of the city of Marquette.
Yeah, and that shot was taken of his studio just before the fire, and that was totally wiped out in 1868. So he had to move into a different studio.
Yep. And then we had Brubaker as well, who was really important. They called him the governor.
And we discovered new photographs of him because of this show, things that have been here maybe almost 100 years that were never known until you opened up the albums and discovered Brubaker and Childs, Mrs. Childs. All these amazing photos were just discovered for this show. Yeah,
some of them I was going through just photographs, they weren't even identified, but we had some other pictures we could compare them to, and then we said, well, this is Childs, and this is Mrs. Childs. And
we've been looking for these photos a long time, and they just got rediscovered, so it was great. Yeah. And over here we have one of the original cameras of the Childs Art Gallery. This is a 11 by 14 dry plate camera that was used by first Charles Cole, who ran the studio until about 1931, and then later by the Bennetts. But this was a field camera, and you actually see some of the equipment when you look at old photographs where the case was, but this is how big that negative was, and this would go behind the camera. So this is an original camera from the Childs Art Gallery.
And then Jack also, and another collector, had some other great equipment for shooting panoramas, for shooting the stereo, some of the cameras that were used.
And actually some of the wet plate negatives that actually made these photographs and went around the lake in 1870. We still have those in the original boxes. But we have a panoramic camera, a stereo camera, and some other equipment in this display. Yeah,
it's wonderful. So B.F. Childs, his studio became one of the longest lasting studios in the area, about 100 years. And he started in Marquette and then also in Ishpeming. And the Ishpeming studio is the one that lasted so long. He wasn't running it all, but a number of people, Cole, Brubaker was doing a lot of the printing there, and he was, I think, taking a lot of the pictures, taking wonderful pictures of pictured rocks over in Munising area, and he took his boat, the Wanderer, in several trips with one or more native guides, and was documenting, all along the shore, including the Canadian shore, a lot of pictures over at the Sioux, a lot of native people. And, those are just priceless images today.
Childs came right when Marquette had the fire. Mm-hmm. So in '68, he actually went to Houghton, and that's how he started working with Brubaker. In fact, one of the shots we have, he's making the original sign for the stereo views, and he says, at Brubaker's Gallery. But yeah, in 1870, he actually went and did the big trip where he went all the way around up into Canada. But he did several trips of pictured rocks, even in the winter and in the summer. Same thing with the cliffs around Marquette and Presque Isle. He did winter and summer views. And in the winter, it was hard to shoot wet plates. Some of the shots we see in the harbor of boats frozen in, can you imagine with glass plates and chemicals how hard that was. But some of these shots also show the interior of the studio, Childs Art Gallery in 1870s, and it was elegant. For a Northwoods town, Marquette had frames that were shipped in from the east. You could look at stereo cards while you're waiting for your portrait appointment. So these are very rare stereo cards that show the inside of the studio.
Yep. One of the great things I loved finding working on this were either studio shots or photographers. In the introduction, we had sometimes we didn't know who they were, but there'd be a tripod and some men, taking a picture, and we were always excited to find those.
Yeah, that was the fun to see that the camera's actually in the photograph or the tent.
So these professional photographers, one of the things that started to happen were taking panoramas, and then you could get a really good sense of a feel for a space, whether it was a mine, a large group of people. I think a lot of us have seen the World War I era. When we get into the teens, they were taking these panoramas, and some of them were really massive, really long images. But when it started, it was just a matter of taking several photos and piecing them together. And we have this kind of crude image here, but it's from 1863, and that's the Marquette Harbor in downtown, really rough. And then we have also in our collection beautiful prints of this that were hand-colored. That didn't make it out today. But then I think it was 1898 when they actually developed a panoramic camera. So then you could create these images, and again, lots of different, we have a lumber mill, we have a TB hospital, a band. I think the band shot, I think it was like gratuitous. It was like, I've got my panorama, I'm gonna shoot this. They could have fit in, it wasn't this band I'm talking about here. It wasn't a real large group, but they showed up that day and they were going to shoot their panoramic shots.
Yeah, and we do have a couple panoramic cameras on display.
We do.
To show people how they worked. Also, right next to this display is something I worked on with a collection I got of the Peterson brothers. They were Gwin photographers. Gwin was called Model Town, and probably more photographs were taken of the development of that town for the Cleveland Cliffs Iron Company. And these photographers also worked out of a traveling tent, and they actually shot portraits inside the tent. It worked like a giant skylight. In fact, one of the shots you see inside here shows you what it looked like inside. But the Peterson collection was a great find for me because, again, it documented a model town that was built knowing where the iron was. Then they built the town instead of the other way around where they caved in the towns later. So this was the Peterson brothers out of Gwin, and they were working from about 1910 right up until about the 1920s. Then they opened a portrait studio that is still there today. It's now an apartment building, but the old skylight is still visible in the building.
So as I said earlier, the photographers were doing studio work, and that was really how they made most of their money. And I think anyone who's really looked at photographs, a lot of us have photo albums from our family from maybe the middle or late 1800s. We've seen the larger cabinet cards, and then the earlier were the C to V, which were, I believe, wet plate technology producing those. So I worked with Jack, and we came up with this idea, and with a volunteer as well, to kind of pay homage to this. And all the photographers, actually this doesn't even cover, I don't think, all of the photographers, but many of the photographers from this era, from the mid to late 1800s. And so part of what they were marketing themselves. And so they had their name on the bottom or their name on the back in the early days. And then they'd create artwork. And, working with these collections, it's always such a wonderful process of discovery and handling these materials. And so we kind of wanted to convey that to look, and you can look at the back. So we created these books, these little albums, where people can turn over and look at the artwork on the back and see who was taking these pictures, the names, the company names.
Right.
It was just really fun.
Talk about photographers. Even Negaunee alone had 20 photographers at the turn of the century. Yeah. So you can't put them all out. It would fill this whole wall.
Right.
And when you look at the Tinder directory about every city's photographers, there was hundreds of them in the UP at the time.
And then they changed their, they were working with one person. Maybe they were learning,
a lot of partnerships.
And then they'd go out on their own or they'd move to a different town. So there's just, it was hard to really clearly document all that. But this kind of helps you to uncover some of that.
And the dating of these came out with the Tinder collection too, as far as you knew what dates they were operating. So if you had a family photo, it pinpoints the date of your family photo, which really helps too.
Yep. And the changes, then you could, when you start to study them, you see there's also changes in how the cards were produced. And embossing came a little bit later. The size. Then there were other odd sizes that were also produced.
Fancy ovals too, and the way they did some art work right on the photograph.
Yep, they really were artists, and this is a great selection that we were able to pick out from Jack's collection because he had them all kind of organized by photographer.
Just UP photographers were all in one box, so it was easy to sort through them. Charles Cole worked at Child's Art Gallery, but originally he was Art Emery's brother-in-law. So in 1868, he's here in Marquette, and then when Childs came, he started working with B.F. Childs, and he worked at the Child's Art Gallery until 1931. So from 1868 to 1931, Charles Cole was a big part of the studio. Here he is in Ishpeming feeding the pigeons. He was known for his love of animals, and the portraiture of dogs and cats in the studio are amazing because you could see the love of his. But he was the one posing in a lot of the stereo cards.
And he was really young at the time. I mean, that was before he was even married.
Right.
He was just a little lad there hanging out with the photographers.
So Cole, like I said, he was one of the longest lasting photographers of all these guys because, again, he was in Ishpeming right till 1931. And he turned it over to the Bennetts, and the Bennetts started working as early as 1911 and then ran it right up to the 1950s.
Yeah.
So here's some guys that worked 40, 50 years in photography.
Jack introduced me to another photographer, a woman named Mrs. Shank. She became Kirkwood. There's a Kirkwood block. Kirkwood was actually the mayor in Negaunee. And she had a kind of complicated family history, had some children. She was married multiple times. Her husband left Negaunee, and she appears to be supporting herself and a couple of kids as a photographer. And we think she learned her photography from her brother before she moved to Michigan. But she, again, was doing like wet plate photography. And then one of the gems we also have in our collection is we have one of the Child's Art Gallery's ledger books that has all the business transactions in the 1870s. And I kept looking through that and, learning little tidbits and how much we're getting charged for, different products, who's getting their picture taken. And I found her name, and she was buying the silver collodion for her wet plate technology, her photographs. So I just thought that was so fascinating.
And for a woman to be a professional photographer in the 1860s was very rare.
Yeah.
And finding her photographs were very hard.
Yep.
But Dave Tinder had a couple, and he shared those with me years ago. And we actually have two of them on display here, the fronts and the backs of early Marion Shank.
And then also, Jack was familiar with some of the family that still live in the area, and so we were able to acquire a picture of her as well. Yeah. So one of the many photographers that we look at was William Kepler, and he had what was called Queen City Studio. So Queen City Studio, one of the things they produced were these kind of unusual sized really narrow, like almost like a bookmark with their name stamped on the bottom. And I wasn't able to find, I asked Jack, well, what are these called? And we didn't really know. They were just, I'm sure it was a very economical way of shooting at the time, probably about the turn of the century. We do have pictures of his studio, and we just a few years ago had acquired about 6 large photo albums that his son had put together, but it included a lot of his work as well, and that was really exciting.
Yeah, his son became an amazing photographer, and that would have been Kenneth Forrest, or was it Eugene?
I think it was Forrest.
It was Forrest Kepler.
Forrest Kepler was.
Oh yeah, his son became an amazing photographer also. And we did find an early shot of his studio with the skylight, all the camera equipment that was here in the museum. It was an amazing find.
Yeah. So then I talk a little bit. We've got these great pictures. Some of them are enlargements. Some are hand colored or pastels, kind of a little odd colors on some of them. Charles Harvey. Some of them we're not always sure who we have. And this is a type of tintype that was colored in a patented, copyrighted process. But one of these that I uncovered that I was really excited about is a picture of Mary Mather, and it was right about the time she got married. And it has a name on it. It says Facette, Chicago, 1865. And so I started looking up the studio, and it was a husband and wife. He was a daguerreotypist in Chicago at the time, and she was hand coloring. And then what do I find but these Civil War, there's a Civil War stamp on this little C to V, and you can see the color laid in on her dress, a very similar pose. And then I'm reading about his wife. A lot of times the women did the hand coloring on these small photographs. Cornelia Facette, they became a team. They went to Washington, D.C. She did some really famous portraits there of all the political figures. They had a studio. He was working for the government, but she had studied watercolor in Europe. And so I believe she did the hand coloring on this painting, and it's really quite beautiful. You can look in the little original photo. There's a table, and she's standing. Here she's sitting and leaning against a table. So just a little tweak to it. But I think that process and the artistry, these were artists first. They weren't. Today we kind of sometimes draw a line between fine art and photography, but back then I think they were really doing all of it. It was a way for an artist to make a living.
Right. A lot of people think these are paintings, but it's a photograph first, and then they would embellish them over, and sometimes using chalk or watercolors. So it's really a painting and a photograph combined.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting stories about local photographers is the story of Raymond Holsey, better known as Black Bart, who was the last stagecoach robber in the UP and was sentenced in 1889 to prison in Marquette, where after he had a little operation on his skull, became a model prisoner and was one of the first prison photographers in Marquette. He actually hand-tinted photographs while he was in prison, made a lot of souvenirs for the gift shop. But he actually, after he got out in 1913, tried to open a photography studio, changed his name to Carl Paul, and was a photographer for a little while, worked up in the Huron Mountain Club as a guide, but kind of interesting story of a killer and badman turned photographer. But this is Raymond Holsey, Black Bart, and we found his original cabinet card where he was captured in Republic, Michigan, and you can see he's handcuffed here. But he later became the prison librarian. You see him in this shot at the prison. But very interesting story of a photographer who started his life in prison, his career in prison, I should say. Well, we have another little bit on women photographers that we discovered in the UP, besides Marion Schenk, who was our earliest. Another one, and I met this woman, Marion Boyer, came up to my studio in the 1980s and shared some photos with me, but she was the first female woman engraver, photographic engraving of plates when she worked for the Escanaba Daily newspaper. She was a graduate in 1935 of the University of Michigan, but she went on to take many great UP photos, and we found a photo of her with her 4x5 camera. But another amazing story is this woman, Mary Jane Halifax, who's been in photography for 60 years in the UP and is still publishing a full-page weekly newspaper story in the Marquette Mining Journal with her photography. And this is a shot of her and her husband, Dick Halifax, who were municipal photographers for many years. And Mary Jane's 94 years old and still shooting photographs. And it's just an amazing story of someone who had a lifetime in photography. I'm also using a lot of her old negatives of municipal, and just an amazing repertoire of work. Over here we have a little display too of the Bennetts. Now again, the Bennetts worked at Child's Art Gallery. Were really the last to run the studio. And we also have a picture of, and this was a father and son. This was Tom Bennett and Tom Jr. who ran the studio. But one of the flashes that went underground into the mines with 3 flash bulbs, because they were also photographers of the mines and did a lot of work inside the mines in the dark. And also over here, another Marquette photographer is Edward Lemon. And we found some photos of him and examples. And one is him standing behind Teddy Roosevelt. And I think that was about 1913 when Roosevelt came here for his trial. But Lemon and the Bennetts are big members of the photography history here.
So the Gustav Warner family, they had a studio. Now Gustav started in Ishpeming, with Moiser, I think it was, and eventually had a studio in Marquette. His parents were German immigrants, and they built a building about a block from here. It's now called Marquette Wallpaper and Paint. They were painters, and also artists. One of the things that I had uncovered was some of Gustav's paintings in our collection, and I think his son Earl did some paintings, and his other son also did some photography as well. But we had these great pictures, so many, it was like the selfies here he was taking, or maybe with one of his sons was taking these pictures of him through different hats, different times. It was really great to see, as well as some pictures of his children, which I thought were, really kind of captured some interesting emotions there.
Yeah, and you found a great shot of his studio, which I never knew existed. But probably what's amazing about Werner is he took probably the largest selling photograph in Michigan history, and that was in 1893 when they had the Chicago World's Fair, and they sent a load of logs from the UP called the World's Fair load of logs. And the nesters who set up this didn't want anybody to take the photo but Mr. Werner. So it was copyrighted in 1893, and the largest order ever made for a single photograph, 20,000 prints were made of this photo. Since then, I've sold thousands of this photo also, so I'm pretty confident to say that the World's Fair load of logs of 1893 is probably the most widely sold photograph ever taken in the UP by Mr. Werner.
So one of the exciting things that we uncovered several years ago, a family member of the Ducharme family came and showed me this beautiful album of wildlife photography, and there's several examples here. And it was of his uncle, Harold Ducharme, had taken these pictures. He also did engravings. So back in the 20s, he got into taking wildlife nighttime photography, just as most of us know Shiras had been doing. Just beautiful work. We have this great picture of the two deer back to back, and he was again in the boat, and he was working with William Harris, was his younger man who was doing the paddling in the back, and several of them really talk about how it was a team effort. It wasn't just one person, because you had to position it. You had to be really quiet in the dark, and position that boat in the right place in order to get these images.
Yeah, this was really something they were inventing as they were going too, just like Shiras did. He started off at daytime, realized nighttime was the time, but these guys in the 20s and 30s were using almost the same kind of a thing, a jack light that would shine the deer, and then they'd let their cameras and flashes go. But we had no idea that Shiras inspired these men from the Huron Mountain Club to do this incredible work.
Right, so there was Harold Ducharme, and then later William Harris was also taking pictures. And then there was this man, Tappan Gregory, who actually wrote several books, and he has a large collection of his glass plates are down at the Chicago Academy of Sciences. He was a lawyer there, and his brother as well. They collected animal skins and, really were into studying the wildlife here and elsewhere. I mean, he'd set up little traps to take pictures of different mice in his backyard. I mean, it was like just the perseverance and the chase, to see if you could do it. But here we have a juvenile porcupine that he took, and it was great to find, that his work was out there, so I was able to use one of those images.
Even diagrams of how he set up his equipment, you discovered that.
Yeah. So I found him because we had one of his books in our library here. But he had produced 2 different books, Eyes in the Night and, what's the second one? And Animals at Night, I think, is the other one.
Well, I've been talking about early photography for 45 years in Marquette, and I had no idea about the work of these 2 men, inspired by George Shiras.
Shiras told a story in his book where he went up to the Huron Mountain Club and he saw a couple of photographers there, met with them or whatever, and they got in a boat, and maybe it was their first time. They got in the boat at night and they let off the flash, which makes a huge bang, and they fell off into the water. But he also said they are taking some of the best pictures. So they kind of developed what he had started.
Yeah. Probably one of the most famous photographers that's been written about, and we could probably spend an hour talking about the man, George Shiras III, who is actually called the father of wildlife photography, because in the late 1880s, he was experimenting with flash powders and cameras, capturing deer at night in the Elger County Whitefish Lake area of Deerton. And his family had come to Marquette as early as 1849 and were very much a staple of the Marquette family. And George married Peter White's daughter, and the story is amazing how he learned to take these wildlife photos. But when he showed his work in Paris in 1900, he stunned the world with these photos, because nobody had ever seen deer photographed either in a zoo before or stuffed. But this guy shot photographs in the wild in their natural settings. And some of the earliest prints go back to the 1890s, and then they were printed over different series. And in 1935, the definitive book about Shiras, called Hunting Wildlife with Camera and Flashlight, came out. And there's a couple prints that were put out by Geographic in the 1930s that you'll see in Marquette. But probably what he's best known for was his conservation work also. He saved so many. A lot of the wildlife laws that we still use today in hunting were called the Shiras laws, shining deer at night. But his greatest accomplishment was, I think, the Bird Migratory Act that saved birds being shot on the nest. So the story of George Shiras is just one that's amazing. But we have examples of his work in different eras, from 1890 to the 1930s. And he also shot stereo cards too.
Yeah, it was really fun to see his stereo cards. And, sometimes I've looked at some of his work and it looks, by today's standards, it's black and white. We're used to these beautiful color photos. But when you understand that in context, that people hadn't seen this before.
Yeah.
And, and then you look at all the techniques that he's doing, trapping them so it triggers a flash and then the camera, 1, 2. And there was a lot involved, and it was kind of dangerous, using this flash powder.
Yeah. And really the best shot was the reaction to the flash. The deer are in midair as they run away, and usually those are the most exciting shots. But this one called Innocents Abroad was written about by the English papers, the French newspapers at the time, mainly because of the beautiful composition also. But the father of wildlife photography is buried right here in Marquette, Michigan.
So here at the Regional History Center, we have our own archive and library, and it's named the John M. Longyear Research Library. And John M. Longyear was a photographer. We have over 40 of his photo albums, as well as numerous other photos and many of the glass plates. We know that he was using the Kodak number 1 or 2, which shot these small round photos. We know he hired photographers to shoot some of the more commercial aspects he was working in. mining over on the west end, land looking, an immensely wealthy entrepreneur, involved in a lot of things, and timber as well. So he would document a lot of the things that he would travel to go look at things, as well as family photos and other images. So in 1889, he and 5 companions made a trip on Lake Superior on his boat, the Abbey. It was a naphtha launch. And there were these wonderful large format, again, must have been glass plates. He didn't have a professional photographer with him. So we really think at least some of these were taken by him. And there's beautiful scenes from Isle Royal and other areas along the lake. So it was really fun to try to uncover his experience with photography and what he was doing. We think he was probably hiring someone to develop these plates. I don't think he was necessarily doing that. I found this picture of a tripod that was set up to capture images at pictured rocks that was in his photo album. Just some gorgeous pictures, again, of pictured rocks and other areas. So it was really fun to go through those images and choose a few for the exhibit. Just some really great work. And again, a wonderful history.